will be starting shortly. In the meantime, if you have slowly. So again, welcome everyone to this virtual workshop. So today's workshop will be specifically about soy, and we'll be sharing more about responsible sourcing toolkits and their role in building capacity of companies in implementing deforestation-free and conversion-free soy commitments. Federica, if we could go to the slide deck. In the meantime, I would like to mention two things. This virtual workshop is recorded, and we also provide interpretation in Spanish. So if you'd like to listen to the content of this workshop in Spanish, you just need to click on the button, which you can find below, and choose the Spanish channel. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll present briefly the objective of today's workshop and the structure. So today's workshop will be an opportunity to understand better the integrated approach to responsible sourcing toolkits in the context of sustainable soy. And we'll be talking specifically about two toolkits and their alignment process. So the Proforest Soy Toolkit and WWF's DCF implementation toolkit. We will jointly analyze the next steps of the integration process, as well discuss challenges and opportunities to move from commitments to action. And thirdly, we'll also identify some gaps and have the opportunity to propose some improvements to this integrated approach. So shortly, we'll be moving to the presentation part. Federica, please, back to the slide before. Thank you. So we'll be moving to the presentation part, and I would like to warmly welcome our presenters. So we'll have today with us Jane Lino, who's the Deputy Director of Proforest Latin America Regional Office, and Luis Izep, who's the Senior Director for Strategic Corporate Engagement at WWF US. So both Jane and Luis will introduce this integrated approach, and we'll talk as well, we'll walk us through both of those toolkits, and among other things, also present next steps in the alignment process. We'll have then a Q&A session, and then we'll move into the breakout room discussions, where we will be specifically approaching the question on how can this integrated approach help companies to move from commitments to action. And I would like to mention here that we will have 3 groups, and they will be divided, as you see, linguistically. So I would kindly ask you to type in the chat box which room you would like to be part. Just write the language, your preferred language, so we can assign you. After the breakout sessions, we'll go back to the plenary where the moderators will share with us the takeaways from the discussions. And the last part will be basically final remarks, next steps, and we'll share a bit as well what other workshops we're planning this quarter as part of the Green Commodities community. So without further ado, I would like to re-welcome Jane and Luis, and the floor is yours.
Well, I can just go first to say hi. It's a pleasure to be here and seeing people from many different countries, many different roles and organizations. So nice to see you all. I'm Jani, as Alexandra said, based in Brazil, working at Proforest for the last 5 years. Most of my time is being dedicated to soy. And it's, yeah, it will be really nice to be here with you today to share what is this integrated approach to support companies in implementing their commitments, and hear your thoughts and feedbacks on how this approach can work better, how it can be improved, what should be clearer, what tools and communication tools could be used to improve this approach and really help drive more positive impact. Yeah, Luis, do you want to introduce yourself? I think after that we may have a poll to start having some warm up from the audience. But Luis, over to you.
Thanks, Jenny. Very briefly, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. This is a great opportunity for us to share experience on not only what we have done so far in the last years in approaching companies to support them in the movement from commitments to action, but looking ahead, because we are aiming something bigger and very interesting in terms of not only integrating different toolkits, but proposing something that makes sense for companies. Instead of having so many different alternatives, we are trying to connect the dots. And then it's going to be easier for companies to see that's the way that we need to follow because the things are already integrated. So glad to be here. My name is Luis Zepp. I'm based in Washington, DC. I've been working from WWF in the last 4 years. I work in most of my time at the CFA Collaboration for Forest and Agriculture Initiative, which is totally connected to this proposal of this workshop. It was where the toolkits were developed, so I'm glad that we are collecting results on that. Now we are reaching a new stage of this initiative. It's not CFA anymore, it's CMI. It's a slightly different acronym, but same proposals, but reaching a broader number of companies. At CFA, we're focused a little bit more on Brazilian companies, and now we are reaching European, Chinese, and US markets. So it's a really exciting environment, and I'm glad to be here and share experience and listen from you on how can we improve this methodology, just like Johnny said. Thank you so much.
Next slide, Federica.
Would we like to start the poll? Just to have a warm up?
Yes, let's start the poll.
Great. I see that some of you are answering. Some are still missing?
Yeah, so we have 34% of response. So maybe we'll take few more answers and we can reveal the results of this first poll.
Sure, great.
Okay, let's maybe Federica show the result.
Yes, so for the first question, answer number B and D were the higher. So to develop a time-bound action plan and to engage suppliers in implementing responsible solutions. And then regarding question number 2, we have as the main response, the procurement team in companies, as well as producer and investor has a high percentage.
Over to you, Jane.
Many thanks, Alexandra. And it's great to see these results because I think they are very aligned with what we are going to talk about today. So super happy to see this alignment. We're going to start presenting a responsible sourcing toolkit developed for soy. So if we move to the next slide, please. The soy toolkit was developed by Proforest in partnership with WWF and funding from the Good Growth Partnership, the Responsible Demand Project, thanks to the financial support of the Global Environment Facility. And it is basically a one-stop shop for companies to implement their responsible sourcing commitments for soy. In the next slide, what we are going to present in more detail, it's really what is this integrated approach for the responsible sourcing toolkit. So really how the soy toolkit helps company implementing their deforestation and conversion-free soy commitments, and really focusing on one of the elements of this circle that you see at more or less at the middle, in the middle of the slide, which has 5 elements for implementing responsible sourcing commitments. And we're going to focus here on the first, and we can say the main element of the implementation of those commitments, which is to assess and plan implementation. So really aligned with your responses to what should be the next steps for companies. It is pretty much about developing a time-bound action plan. And then we have a moment for questions before the breakout. So in the next slide, just explaining a bit why the soy toolkit, this integrated approach was developed. There are multiple challenges in implementing responsible sourcing commitments. And they are, I think it would be good to concentrate here in 2 main challenges. One is very generic and applicable to any commodity, and it's because it's related to the fact that when we think about social and environmental concerns, they are usually present at the production level. Mostly present at the production level. So this means if there is deforestation, if there are human rights abuses, non-inclusion of smallholders, encroachment of protected areas or traditional communities, those all happen at the production level. But the companies that make big commitments to address those issues and to tackle them and eliminate them, they are usually they're usually closer to the consumer. So they are consumer facing companies. And here we see some logos of big companies that have made robust and strong commitments to address deforestation and human rights abuses in their supply chain. But how do those companies really address those challenges and really eliminate those issues from their supply chain? It really depends on, and again, aligned with your answers, on supplier engagement. So those companies, they need not only to have strong commitments, but also they need to have a clear plan and implement this plan by cascading their commitments, engaging their suppliers and requesting their suppliers to engage their own suppliers. So this movement gets down to the production level where the practices really need to be changed. In the next slide, I think there are a few gaps that we wanted to highlight in this process of implementation. Through experience engaging companies, we identified that there are a few gaps, and they are mostly related to communication in the supply chain and within companies. One is, of course, in this process of cascading commitments, the language that is used and the main terms and the main concerns, the perspectives, they are different between a company that is consumer facing like a retailer or a restaurant chain and a producer or a trader that is buying soy from producers, for example. So there are some communications gap between those two ends of the supply chain. And even within the companies, there are also gaps between the different teams that are involved. So we have sustainability teams that are really engaged and really trying to make production more sustainable and sourcing more sustainable. And there is the procurement team, which have usually different targets. Their success in their work is not measured by how sustainable the soy that they are sourcing is, but how much soy they are sourcing for the lowest price, for example. So the challenge in bringing those two ends of the supply chain, those two types of teams together, really relies on having very clear communication and clear tools and creating the capacity in the different teams so they can talk to each other. And finally, even inside big companies, and this is more specifically to global companies, there are also some gaps between headquarters, which are usually based in Europe or in the US or even in China, and local offices of those companies, which usually have a different governance and different perspectives as well, because they're closer to where the material, in our case, soy, is produced. The next slide is really about another challenge that is actually very specific to soy and is the result of a very positive thing. In soy, over the last 5 to 6 years, there has been the development of multiple different initiatives, solutions, tools, resources, approaches. And here in this slide, we show just a few of them. There are still more being developed. At the bottom of the slide, you can see that there are over 80 initiatives that we have mapped, and definitely there is more today. And this is great because companies can have free resources to help them implement their commitments, but it also creates a lot of confusion because they don't know when to use each type of resource. And in this next slide, it's really this is the reason why we developed the soy toolkit, this responsible sourcing approach. If you click once more, it really shows the image again that you already saw of those 5 elements to implement commitments. So we're starting at the center with assessing and planning implementation, then companies need then to start understanding their supply chain, engaging their suppliers, establishing purchase control systems to really make sure they don't source products that are non-compliant with their policies, and then monitor, verify, and report on their progress and performance. And here we are just quickly placing some of the logos that you saw in the previous slide, just to show what the soy toolkit is trying to deliver to companies. It's really positioning the different resources in the right step, so companies understand when they can use it, what are the preconditions, the prerequisites they need to meet in order to be able to use those resources. Also, if the resource is more useful for a company that is downstream or upstream, and who in the company could be best placed to use those resources. The soy toolkit is, if you click once more, we are showing what is the type of materials that are available. The soy toolkit is a free capacity building program. It is available online in our website. There are multiple materials that can be used by companies. There are briefing notes, which are those screenshots that we're sharing in the slide. There are executive summaries of each of those briefing notes. The briefing notes are longer guidances. The executive summaries are much shorter. And we also have videos, webinars, interviews, different types of materials that can help companies understand this landscape of different initiatives. There are a few examples in the next slides, which I won't go through in a lot of detail, but just to show you how it works in practice. So, for example, in purchase control systems, we really bring the example of this Amazon soy moratorium, which is a great initiative for companies that have deforestation-free commitments when sourcing from the Amazon biome. In the next slide, we see another example of footprint calculation. So companies that source soy embedded in animal products like chicken or dairy, they face some challenges in even understanding how much soy is embedded in the product that they are sourcing. So there is a material and a guidance about footprint calculation there, in which we share a case study from McDonald's, who partnered with AgroTools, a service provider, to estimate their soy footprint. And then finally, in the next slide, another example is the assessing and planning step, which is the main step, the first step of implementation. And it is about developing time-bound action plans, time-bound implementation plans. And in the guidance, in the briefing note, we go through the small steps, the activities that companies need to go through to implement, to develop this implementation plan. For example, developing their implementation strategy, defining the main activities, assigning the tasks and getting buy-in from the company, developing a time frame, and communicating and reviewing that plan. So in the resources, you can see examples of how companies can develop this implementation plan that is time-bound, that has a good quality, and it can be used for companies to monitor their progress in implementation. And this is exactly where I hand over to Luis, because in the assessing and planning element of the toolkit is where most of the progress has been done recently, trying to help companies to move from setting good commitments to start implementing them. So stop here, and next slide is already Luis speaking to you. Many thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. This is great. I can say that the integration is really important, because exactly what you said about the multiple alternatives that companies have today for trying to solve anything related to a DCF space. There are a huge number of tools, processes, references, documents, and we realized that instead of creating even more, it would be much better to try to connect the dots and show how the different things work together. And that's the aim of this presentation, because if you look to this picture is key. It is related to the poll, because there's a difference on going straight to a solution. Most of the companies say, oh, what I need to do is just to implement a monitoring system. That's it, I'm done. Other companies say, well, what I need to do is just to have a reporting system, because I'm doing so good on other stuffs. So what is missing is a sense of how the different elements works together. And the central piece is a way to create a plan, because the plan will address the different gaps. And then the plan is going to be very specific per company, but using the same framework. That's the importance, because once companies start having different implementation plans, but kind of talking the same language in terms of the 5 elements, it's going to be easier to discuss these plans and actions through the supply chain. So that's the idea. So I will focus a little bit more on the central element, as Jenny mentioned, because what used to be a different toolkit that I'm going to start to talk about it actually is a very, very good fit on becoming the tool to support the central element. In one of the previous slides, Jenny mentioned some different options for, it's a kind of 5 or 6 below, but you can stay on this. There are some existing tools to support each of the elements, except on the middle. because the middle is where we are going to start to talk about the existing tools that we develop on the other side. So if we can move the slide now to the next one. One more. Yes, that's what used to be the DCF implementation toolkit. Sounds like a different toolkit, and that was an issue with companies because actually both toolkits, the responsible sourcing for soy and the DCF implementation toolkits, they were developed in parallel. And we had a lot of meetings, myself and Johnny and others, in order to make them integrated. But guess what? Integrate is much more than just using the same elements. And that's the reason for the recent work that even beyond integration, we are now talking about the same toolkit. But this is where this slide is about how this DCF implementation toolkit started a couple of years ago. It started to connect to the accountability framework initiative, which is another important element to bring to this conversation. Because the accountability framework initiative is a kind of reference. That's how I talk to companies. If you need some reference, you need some definitions to understand what deforestation means, what is a cutoff date. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Go for this big reference, which is the accountability framework. But then companies were going to that website, and there are so many different guidance and documents there that, again, companies were lost on what are the steps? How do we start? How can I know if I'm in the middle? I know that is a journey. Journey is a pretty important word in this arena, because we are talking companies that you don't need to be 100% good tomorrow. You have time to create a plan and implement a plan, and it's a journey. The journey that starts by setting a commitment, and then you need to take some actions to implement the commitment, and then you need to demonstrate results. So these 3 steps are pretty easy for companies to understand. But what was not easy for companies to understand is how to do it. So that's the reason for this DCF implementation toolkit is a kind of roadmap to help companies to know what to do and how to do to achieve this stage. So if you can move to the next slide, please. And then the core of the DCF implementation toolkit is a simple process where, and this is a process, the good thing about it is that this is not for sustainability, this is not for DCF, this is the way a company usually thinks in any type of problem. If they have a problem with accounting on HR systems, a company thinks like, I need to understand the problem, I need to make a plan, and I need to execute the plan. So this is a common language. So once we started to use this on the sustainability and DCF, deforestation and conversion-free space, then the sustainability team say, wow, this is not difficult to convince the other departments because we are speaking on their language. So usually we are just saying that we need to start with a gap analysis, because you need to understand in which part of the journey you are. You have already a good policy, you have zero, we have already a good monitoring system, we are talking to the suppliers, companies are in different stages of the journey. So let's start with an assessment. And there are some tools in Excel format for the moment to help companies to do this gap analysis. It's a lot of questions, drop-down lists, a lot of intelligence for companies to have a gap analysis. Then the second step, okay, I have a gap analysis. I understand where I am. So I need to fill the gaps. So nothing better than a template where you can bring the results of the gap analysis and fill the blanks and say, okay, I'm not so good in engaging suppliers. So I need to create some actions to fix that and have a consistent plan. So the second element is creating a template, which is really important for companies to have the same format on their implementation plans. And the third element is just executing actions and using the different existing tools. But it's much more easier for companies to use any tool when it's part of a comprehensive action plan. Then they need why they are doing each of the actions, and all the actions are going to work together towards the same objective. So that's the core, let's say, intelligence of this tool. Gap analysis, implementation plan, and then execute. If you can move to the next slide, please. Then we can come back to what Janie presented. Remember the responsible sourcing for soy, but that applies also for other commodities. You're going to be exploring more the other commodities later. I know that the focus today is for soy, but if you look to this picture, it's kind of intuitive for companies to start by the center and running the assessment and plan. And that's exactly what I just explained, that it's the core for the used to be the DCF implementation toolkit. So that's the integration. Instead of sounds like we have two different toolkits, what we do have is an intelligence for you to start implementing the central element. You can start to work on the central element by doing a gap analysis, creating an implementation plan. This implementation plan needs to be agreed with your other departments. You have to create buy-in. You have to be clear in what you need to do. And then it's just to execute the plan. So that's the spirit of the integration. That's how this new responsible sourcing toolkit is going to work. And then if we can move to the next slide, I will give you an example on how it's the final product of an assess and implementation plan. So this is an example of what companies receive at the end. So once they did a gap analysis, they realized that there's a lack of activities that they need to develop. If we can move one more, because the next one is clear on monitoring. The next slide, please. Yes. So this is one of, remember the picture when you have 5 elements? This is one of the 4 external elements: monitoring, verifying, reports. So the result of the methodology here is based on the gap analysis. That's the template where you can fill your gaps. So you create some key actions, and for each of the key actions, we need to establish clear milestones when you're going to be reaching the results of the action. And most important, it has to be measurable. It has to have indicators. So you need to communicate well what and when you're going to reach each of the activities. Last and very important, on the last column, that's where you connect the dots with the existing tools. Now we are talking to companies that for each action on your implementation plan, there are specific tools. Then you're going to be sure that you are using the right tool at the right moment under a comprehensive implementation plan. We are offering companies the framework to have one of these tables for each of the external elements. Usually they have 4 tables for the 4 external circles on the framework that Johnny presented. And we are starting to have a big number of companies using the same format, which is the next slide, please. That's an evolution on what has been done so far. This is pretty impressive. This is kind of 2 years. It started 2 years ago, and we started with 5 companies. We need to convince champions, the pioneers. And do you want to try a methodology for you to create an implementation plan? And this is really important. If you need some way to summarize for companies, what is this about? Is the ability to create a concrete implementation plan, a DCF implementation plan, because everything is going to be based on this implementation plan. So at the beginning, we had 5 companies doing this as kind of pioneers. But very quickly, once we start having cases to tell, and even companies talking to companies about their experience, 5 has become 25. But it's still in a very, very slow movement of talking to each company separately. Then was the very interesting part of the story. Once companies start having the same format of implementation plans, they have the idea, wow, can I extend this methodology to my suppliers? So companies like a big retailer, like a Carrefour or a Danone, they can say, I have 20 suppliers. It will be good if they run the same exercise. Then 25 became 60 very quickly. And now 60 is becoming more than 100, because this idea on having hubs, as we call, a company that offered exercise to a number of suppliers, is reaching a global level. So what started in Brazil, now we are having these platforms or hubs in Europe. We are aiming to reach China and US. So then the number of companies become really interesting. And by the way, once you have a larger number of companies using the same methodology, the same framework, it's easier to bring other actors, such as investors, financial institutions, because it's really interesting for financial institutions if companies are using the same format, because then it's going to be the format that financial institution is going to ask for DCF information in order for screening on new investments. So what we are creating here is trying to create a standard. Companies using the same format for creating implementation plans and actions under these implementation plans following the guidelines on the responsible sourcing. Soy Toolkit, but also for other commodities as we're gonna present right now. Now I'm gonna hand it back to Jenny for exploring a little bit more on the interactions and integration and next steps. Jenny, it's on you.
Thank you so much, Luis. Yes, on the next slide, and it will be really good to hear your thoughts then after that, is if you click just once more, Federica, please. Yes, perfect. So this is exactly the first top left part of the slide is really showing exactly what Luis was saying. The DCF toolkit is the main tool to help companies deliver on the central element of the soy toolkit, and this is the integration that we have been working on. There are many similarities in the content of both toolkits. So if you look at the top right part of the slide, those there are also some slight differences. So I think what is the intention of this slide is really to tell you a bit what we have done in practice to integrate those two toolkits, since they were developed in parallel and not integrated at first, although they have, as I said, many similarities, and what still we still need to do for a complete integration. So there are some slight differences in the themes of what each toolkit cover. In the soy toolkit, we are covering DCFs, deforestation and conversion free, but also human rights abuses, which is also in line with the accountability framework. And the DCF toolkit, as the name said, is really focusing on DCF. There are some elements of ethical supply chains, and this is something we are working on to make it even more integrated. The soy toolkit also covers actions companies can take beyond their own supply chains, meaning what they can do in engagement with landscape approaches, jurisdictional approaches, for example. And this is also something that we are working on for the DCF toolkit. On the other hand, for geographies, the soy toolkit was initially developed with tools that are applicable to Brazil. But of course, the steps and the different activities and resources, they usually are applicable to other geographies as well. The DCF toolkit was already developed with this in mind, so the tools are applicable to Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. In terms of companies, both were developed for sure for soy supply chains in any part of the supply chain, but also, again, as Luis said, it can work beyond the soy supply chain, because the steps, they would work. And the tools developed by the DCF toolkit, the templates for action plan, they could work for a beef company, for a palm oil company, for a rubber company. And the steps proposed is really integrated in a way that the resources offered by the DCF toolkit really address the central element of the soy toolkit and really cover this 3-step approach, which is assess, plan, and execute. We are working on the communication of this integrated approach, so it really appears to companies and other stakeholders as one thing. There is a website for the soy toolkit right now, and there is some work being done to have this website as a neutral branding, so it doesn't look like different things that are talking about the same approach, but they look different. So really trying to work so they look the same. There are inclusions of the DCF assessing and planning tools in the website of the soy toolkit as it is right now. But we're also thinking about how it can be improved to to be able to support companies in the execution of the plan. So having, for example, a space for companies to share experiences online in the website. So working as a platform, for example, and also the inclusion of other commodities like beef, palm oil, and make sure this integration really happens for other commodities as well. And then finally, at the bottom right of the slide is the other point of integration is about delivery. The Soy Toolkit has resources online, like online modules and webinars that can be accessed by anybody at any time. There are discussions about how companies can engage their own suppliers in this capacity building journey and really monitor the progress of their suppliers. So we're also discussing how to offer resources that companies can really see what their suppliers are seeing and how they are improving. And also working on the creation and the improvement of suppliers hubs with the on-demand training courses, for example, and the support to soy DCF initiatives. So initiatives that are already working, companies are working together pre-competitively to develop and implement DCF policy commitments. How can this integrated approach support those initiatives to really deliver on their goals? So there are still some steps that we are working on. And I think this is exactly where we felt this moment was a very good moment to share this approach with you and hear your thoughts on how and where we should really focus our attention to really help this integrated approach look like one and support companies in implementing their commitments as fast as possible. So I believe we can have a few minutes for questions before we go into breakout. So just yeah, Federico or Alexandre for controlling the time, just how many minutes we have. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeanne and Luis, for the presentation. So we have roughly 15 minutes for the Q&A session. So if you have any questions about the integrated approach, or you have any comments which would include any ideas about on improvement or some experience that you have based on working on other types of commodities, because based on the audience, I see as well some colleagues joining who are working on palm oil, pineapple, and beef. So if you would like to share your experience or questions, please do. Yes, please type your question in the chat box. And we can stop sharing the presentation for now. Thank you. Also, you're invited to ask your question if you prefer so. So just feel free to unmute yourself and ask it. So we have one question could you talk more about companies that have started using one of the soy toolkit and start to include DCF commitments? Any recommended approach to that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think, Luis, you can maybe bring others, but one that comes to my mind that would be interesting to mention, because used the soy toolkit and the DCF toolkit, is McDonald's. We partnered with McDonald's to even develop a guidance for other companies to calculate the soy volume embedded in their products. And sharing McDonald's case was really interesting, and we received a lot of very positive feedback from other companies that were happy to see an example that is very practical and very open to share what were the challenges they faced, and which steps they took to actually calculate the soy in their supply chain, and how they used the results of those calculations. And they also used the DCF toolkit. So I think, yeah, Louise or Annie can also add another example, but this is the one that comes to my mind.
Thanks, Jenny. Maybe I can bring a different type of example so you can have a full picture. So Jenny brought an example for one company. Another example is when you reach a group of companies, as I mentioned before. And there's a good example on the SAI, which is a Sustainability Agriculture Initiative. There's a group inside SAI on a dairy partnership, sustainable dairy partnership. Companies like Danone and others that there has a strong dependence on soy for the dairy products. They decided, like 10 companies together, decided to discuss how to have an approach on the DCF. And the first reaction was, let's look for references. And of course, they went to the Accountability Framework Initiative. And then they said, okay, it seems like I know what needs to be done, but we have no idea on how. Then there was an opportunity for us to convene this platform and work with 10 companies at the same time, big companies, like I said, Danone, Unilever, Nestle, and others, and using this responsible sourcing toolkits as a way to start an assessment and planning exercise. So we run the gap analysis with these 10 companies at the same time. It was very interesting because the exercise was individual, because of course the information is sensitive, but the process was shared. So we had some milestone at the group, and the 10 companies say they could share experience on what they feeling about the tools using the Excel files and the templates. But the exercise was of course individual. But at the end, they finalized at the same time and came back to the platform and say, that's what I have now. I have my gap analysis. So what now? And the next step were kind of twofold. So one is each company has an individual path, of course, because of the result of the gap analysis. But there were some common gaps and common initiatives. And then the platform could use these common gaps in order to have a common exercise, which can, for instance, can be an action to put some pressure on a soy trader to deliver this type of product that they need. So it's a good example on how, when companies are using the same format, they can aggregate the need and they can put a much more effective pressure over the next part of the supply chain because they are using the same language. So that's the example that I can bring on a platform and a group of companies.
Thank you. The second question is, what are the main challenges encountered between producers and buyers in the supply chain in meeting those commitments?
Maybe I can start this time, and Jenny, please feel free to complete me. We are running this exercise mostly on the demand side on companies, because the companies on the demand side, they feel like more pressure, like Jenny mentioned before. Then they realize the importance of running these tools and doing implementation plans. So the big challenge is that they don't have, number one, they don't have the full picture. they are kind of surprised when they see the complexity, in the good sense, of the 5 elements, because they were just thinking about implementing one action, or some of the companies are just thinking about a statement. So if I run my DCF statement, and I'm saying that is important for having a DCF soil, that's okay. No, it's just the beginning, it's just the top of the iceberg. So the first challenge for demand companies to realize the size of the problem and how many actions they need to develop to do that. The second related thing is that when they realize the importance of having different actions, they feel like, oh, but I'm not so close of, and the next part of the supply chain is the soy traders, where they buy soy. How can I tell the soy traders what I need? And I say, well, today you are feeling this challenge because you don't have a format. So if you have a clear implementation plan, it's going to be easier for you to put more pressure and ask what you need. So the challenge is that they don't realize the power on putting some pressure because they're using the same format. They start to realize pretty slowly, which gives space on the supply side to kind of just deliver a small amount of DCF soy and say, that's okay, I have the product that you need. But this does not solve the issue on deforestation. What you need is ideally to have a DCF supplier, not a DCF product. So the challenge is how companies realizing the exercise feel the power on changing the environment and having DCF suppliers, because different sectors are asking for the same thing. It's quite common for these companies to solve a small issue and say that's done, which is very comfortable on the supplier side. Jenny, any extra challenge?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, definitely. Those are very, very important ones. And I think there are three challenges I think would be good to highlight. One is the distance between the companies and the producers. As Luis was saying, like the supply chain is quite complex. So the producers are not their main suppliers. So it's not a direct engagement. The second is, I think when talking to producers, or also even to considering producing countries, because companies are so removed, the companies implementing commitments, sometimes when they go through this type of risk assessment and they assess the risk of producing regions, they start wondering if it would be easier for them to stop sourcing from high risk origins to avoid the risk. And I think this is a big challenge we have in complex supply chains, because it's really trying to help companies not to run away from the risk, but on the contrary, to continue on high risk areas and give one step further to identify the good producers in high risk landscapes and engage those, so they can be good examples for the others that are not yet compliant with companies' policies. And this links to the third, which I think it's incentives for those producers that are already compliant with the law, and even going beyond the law by not deforesting. How can those producers be identified and incentivized and really like prized for what they are doing? So I think there's still a challenge in the supply chain. What we try to do with the soy toolkit, and the DCF toolkit covers that as well, is not enough to stop at risk assessment. You really need to move as fast as possible to supplier engagement, so you can really understand and have more information and identify those suppliers that need your support, instead of just running away from the risk.
Thank you. And the last question is about the response. So what is the usual response from companies, but specifically from the procurement teams to these toolkits?
Yeah, I can go first on this one, and it's a great question, because it is true that our entry point is usually through sustainability teams, because they are the ones really working on those matters. But as we are talking about capacity building, usually they want to bring it to their colleagues, to the procurement team. So it has been quite interesting to see that through the toolkit, we are having access to people that were not usually at the table discussing policies and what needs to be done, because it is about capacity building. So it's actually giving the opportunity to engage the procurement team in a more meaningful way, and goes beyond capacity building, because in the end, when you're delivering a training course, you're actually listening to some feedback that even improves the materials and the way we deliver the training courses. So it has been quite positive in terms of engaging the procurement team, understanding that we need to start from building capacity, but the building capacity is about listening them as well. But Luis, yeah.
Yeah, now very briefly, I see a positive thing and a challenge. The positive thing is exactly what Jenny mentioned. When we run the gap analysis is a very concrete tool. There are concrete questions, there are concrete table at the end, and this is the language that the procurement team likes. So yes, the sustainability team, so that's great because it's easier to bring the other departments because we are using tools that they understand. So that's the positive part. It's easy to engage them. And they really like the results. They say, well, this is the first time that I've seen some sort of sustainability work in a format that I realize that is my work, my daily work. The challenge is that these guys are too risky oriented. So at the end, they look at the results of the gap analysis and say, okay, so that's the risk that I have. So I want to avoid the risk, or maybe what I need to be sure that there's existing soil for what I need. So I'm afraid of putting an action here that can bring me some burden later. So the difficulty, once these guys are on the table and discussing, we need to convince that it's not just about risk. It's about also opportunities and a very broader space. But the good thing is that they are starting to participate on these discussions, and they didn't before.
Thank you, Luis and Janet. So I'm mindful of the time. We still have one question in the chat box, and maybe after we're back from the breakout rooms, there will be an opportunity even in typing the answer to respond to Jairo. But in the meantime, we will be moving to the breakout sessions. Federica, if you could put back the slide.
Yes.
So considering the number of people, we'll actually gonna have 2 rooms. We're not gonna have 3 breakout rooms. And the question which will be discussed is how can the integrated approach for responsible sourcing help companies to move from commitments towards concrete action to achieve actual impact. We're going to have around 20 minutes for that, and then we'll meet again in the plenary for key takeaways and for the closure of the workshop. With this, I hope you'll enjoy your discussions and see you in 20 minutes. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some good discussions in your breakout rooms. And now we reach the final part of the workshop. And first we'll start with hearing the takeaways from the discussions. So I'll be inviting Luis and Janet to share things that came up during your conversation and things that you'd like to share with the rest of the participants.
Do you want to go first, Jenny, or should I start?
You can start.
Okay, thanks. It was a pretty good discussion. there was basically 3 points that I'd like to report. And please, Pascal, Margaret, and the others help me if I forget something. So 3 points. So the first point that we discussed was about the relationship between procurement teams and sustainability teams, how to use this knowledge to bring the procurement teams. We discussed this at the presentation before, but how it's working actually, and what happens at the end. So the discussion was, it depends, because companies are so different. From one side you have a McDonald's, from the other side you have a pretty small meat packer. But what makes difference at the end is to have a strong buy-in. It's not just about offering a tool. It's about offering a tool maybe to the operational teams as a bottom-up approach, but at the same time there's a need of work at the C-suite levels or board members in order for them to give endorsement to the exercise, and especially to become an exercise that is not a sustainability exercise. It's an exercise that is important for the company, and then the other departments will be invited to join. So that was the first point. The second point was about privacy, and it's an exercise, it's a gap analysis. It's supposed to identify issues, and it's an NGO that is asking for your issues. So it's not easy for a company to demonstrate that you have a lot of issues to an NGO. So there's a need to get some sort of trust and tell them that that's an exercise that is an internal exercise. It's for you to understand how to create an implementation plan. So it's for you to understand the problem. It's not for me to go to a campaign or etc. So this is the first part. This is getting better. Once we tell companies that we are not going to use the results of the assessment, it's internal. But then you have the second challenge. At the end, if you have a gap analysis that you don't convert to an implementation plan, or if you convert to an implementation plan but keep it secret, what's the point of having an implementation plan that is secret? So the other stakeholders won't be able to understand what you want to do. So there's a second shift in this kind of contradictory, because you need to say, okay, now that you're doing an implementation plan, you need to be transparent. It's really complicated. And one of the solutions to that, it's again, at the end of the process on the implementation plan stage, to have the neutral space, to leave the NGO pressure. The NGO brought the knowledge, but the knowledge is on a public space, is a neutral space, is not a WWF space, is a responsible sourcing space for you to start to talk to other companies on how to make it public, how to communicate progress. So that's the way. There's a need of breaking this dependency on an NGO pressure. The third point and last one was about the future. What has to be done with this knowledge that we do have available? So the first thing is how to think about ideas on the point of making the implementation plans public, making the results of this work public. And there's a suggestion, maybe connecting what's going to be the future website, the neutral website, to connect it to existing efforts related to transparency. And we discussed about the Soil Transparency Coalition. There's an existing work to make companies be more accountable, and where are the volumes that are related to DCF commitments and implementation plans. So the max that you can connect to these existing initiatives to put more pressure on being transparent, the better. Another related point on the future was that's really hard for just one type of organization to push for this methodology and responsible sourcing knowledge. There's a need of bringing others. Governments, if there's a way to governments start to put in some information like, we are recommending companies to do things like that. It's good for our policies if you'll be able to do things like that. So there's a need of putting some other stakeholders, putting pressure. Government was one of them. Investors, definitely, if we can work more with investors to make them also push for this type of work, then is a pressure that companies will feel. And the last point is about producers, the most important point. That's where the change needs to take place. And then the bridge that needs to be built is how the result of all this work on implementation plans and actions and etc. can translate to incentives to producers. How the producers will feel like, because they are being more organized and they are understanding the problem and their actions, part of these actions are organized towards incentives for my work, my daily work as producers. And then we had just 1 minute to discuss how to address that. But the idea was we need to socialize. The best you can socialize this knowledge, then you can maybe fill the gap of getting closer to the producers, because they're going to know that this is happening. So it has to be something that is known in all the different parts of the supply chain. So I'm sorry for the long summary, but it was a rich discussion. So Johnny, over to you.
It's super complimentary. It's really nice. It's just, I think maybe the other way around. We started from the producers and then we touched on how the implementation plan needs to cover the costs of implementation and the incentives. And then we went into investors on how to finance those interventions and improvements in the supply chain and for producers, and also engagement with the government. So it's really interesting to see that it was very aligned. I know we are on time, so hand over to Alexandra.
Thank you very much. Lots of insights. As we're on time already, very quickly, we're just going to launch a very quick learning poll. So you have 2 questions about the workshop, and feel free to respond so we get your feedback. While doing so, I also encourage you to visit our digital platform, as we have posted the program of the events for Q4. And in a second, I'm just going to share quickly the slide with the upcoming events.
Thank you for all the people that are answering. At the moment, we have 53 responses, and that's great. Great to hear. Actually more right now. So please, you still have a few seconds if you would like to give your opinion.
Okay, I think we can close the poll. I would also like to mention that, of course, after the workshop, within the next week, we will send a post-workshop email where we will send the recording of this virtual workshop with a PowerPoint presentation, and we'll share as well the links where you can visit the websites regarding the soy toolkit and the DCF implementation toolkit. And yes, last but not least, very quickly, Federica, if you can share the last slide. Yes, one before. Okay. So just stay tuned for the upcoming events that we have. So next week on Wednesday, we will have a workshop led by ICEAL. We also have another workshop, which will be led by ProForest about the Cerrado Beef Protocol on November 18th. And in addition, we also have 3 big events, which are organized either by the UNDP GCP program or the GGP. So we have the launch of the 10 years report of the Green Commodities program. There will be an event of GGP about the integrated supply chain approach. And we have launched as well a methodology on effective collaborative action, and we'll have an open session on that one on November 9th. So all information are available on the digital platform, and I hope you will join us. And I want to thank very much Jane and Luis for the presentation, and also other colleagues from WWF and ProForest. A big thank you as well to Mariana for helping to organize and coordinate this event. And of course, thank you to our interpreters, Miria and Verushka, and to Federica for supporting us with the tech. And I'm wishing everyone a great day or a great afternoon. Thank you.